Hey guys, Will here. So I got something really interesting for you today. This is the brand new Cammus C12 integrated wheel and wheelbase coming in at 12 Newton meters of strength. Now, that sits it right in the sweet spot, in my opinion, for direct drive force feedback strength. But what makes this particularly interesting is that it comes in at 30 to 50% cheaper than anything else that competes with it, at least in terms of strength. So is it as good as it sounds on paper? Well, that's what we're gonna be finding out today. So let's dive in. So as always, before we dive into today's review, let's just quickly cover off some important information so you have the full context of exactly what we're doing today. So firstly, a big thank you to Cammus for sending across this new wheelbase for us to check out. Now we will be cross comparing against a bunch of other products in today's video. So it's important that you know that all of those products have been sent to us under exactly the same conditions. Now we do have some affiliate links available for all of the products that we'll be talking about in today's video as well. So if you are in the market and you decide that you want to pick up any of the stuff we talk about, if you use those links, it's an awesome way of helping support our work here at Boosted Media at no additional cost to you. And that's something that's just available to you guys if you find what we do here of benefit and you want to help support us at no additional cost. So we really do appreciate your support there. Now we do also have some discount codes available for a lot of the brands that we'll be talking about as well. So check down in that description box. You may find yourself a nice little discount that will take a little bit off the price for you. We do have a discount code for 5% off Cammus as well. So just make sure you consider that when we're talking about pricing in just a minute. But as is always the case here at Boosted Media, no third party has any sort of external control over anything that we're going to be talking about today. Purely just sharing my own observations and my own opinions about this product and all the other products that we'll be comparing to today. So I think that covers off everything you need to know before we dive in. So let's do exactly that now and start off by talking about pricing. So I hyped this up quite a bit in the intro. The price for this guy is $549 US. Now they have a pre-order system on their website at the moment where you can pay $50 to place a pre-order and then they won't charge you the rest of the fee until the product starts shipping, I believe. That's my understanding of how it's gonna work. Anyway, now we do have a 5% discount code available, linked down in the description below for you guys on top of that as well. But just make sure obviously you factor in any shipping or import duties, taxes and whatnot. Make sure you do your own research there to make sure you don't run into any hidden costs. Now there is also a desk clamp accessory, which does also have a standard FANATEC mount on the bottom of it as well. Now I would recommend that you purchase this for a couple of reasons. We'll get into that in just a minute. So that's optional but somewhat necessary accessory, comes in at $29 US additional on top of that. So as I said in the intro, that sits at 30 to 50% cheaper than anything else that competes with it at this kind of strength level. So to just run through a couple of options here, you've got the new Club Sport DD, and again we do have reviews of pretty much all the stuff that we'll be talking about here, separate reviews that you can go through and see all the details on each of these products. But the Club Sport DD from FANATEC, that has 12 Newton meters of holding torque. That on its own is $799.95 US. The Alpha Mini from SIMAGIC, which we've been very impressed with, we'll have a full review coming on that very soon. That is around 10 Newton meters of holding torque, so a little bit less than what you get with the Club Sport DD. This one is rated at 12 Newton meters, but they don't say whether it's holding or peak torque. In my experience using the wheel, they feel about the same as each other, so not a massive significant difference between them. The Alpha Mini, you're looking at $539 US, and that is just the base on its own. Now the cool thing about this particular wheel, just like the C5, you can see the wheel and the base, which is an outrunner style motor, is all integrated into the one unit. So there's no quick release, there's no hidden or additional costs there in terms of adapters or anything that you need to get up and running. It is all just integrated into the one base. And as you can see here, the wheel is interchangeable. We'll talk about that in just a minute too. But if you're looking at the SIMAGIC Alpha Mini, you're looking at $539 US. That doesn't come with a wheel. So you will then need to buy a wheel on top of that. The cheapest options that they have are the GT1 wheel, which is $359 US, or the GT Neo wheel, which is $289 US. We checked that out just recently on the channel and we're very, very impressed with that wheel. So I would definitely recommend check out that review if you haven't already. We do have a 3% discount code available for SIMAGIC, so that will save you a little bit on top of that. So quite a significant amount more money there for the Alpha Mini once you factor in the cost of a wheel, which as we mentioned is integrated in this particular scenario. You then have the FANATEC Ready to Race bundle, 8 Newton meters, which comes with the CSL DD, the boost kit to step that up to 8 Newton meters of torque, and then a P1 wheel. It also comes included with CSL pedals, which aren't absolutely fantastic pedals, but there are some mods available for those, as well as a load cell upgrade kit, which do step them up in quality. $499.80 US. Now the big difference there is that the wheel that you get there is nowhere near the same kind of build quality as what you're getting here overall. You also need to factor in there that that does come with the older QR1 style quick release, the QR1 simplified, which does have quite a bit of flex in it. So in terms of rigidity rigidity and strength and just the overall quality of the wheel in your hands, not really in the same ballpark as what we have here. But we'll talk about the differences in force feedback when we get into driving test a little bit later on. But that is another option. You then have the Moza R9 V2, a little bit weaker than what we have with this particular wheelbase, but still enough for the majority of people. Again, we do have a detailed review of that available for you guys. That guy comes in at $399 US, so a little bit cheaper, but again, you will have to factor in the cost of a wheel on top of that. So the cheapest option there in terms of a wheel is the R9 plus the CS wheel, which would come in at $659 US plus taxes and shipping. So around $160 more expensive than what we have here once again. And then you also have the Moza R12 wheelbase rated at the same Newton meters as what we have here. So more of a like for like comparison in terms of strength at least. That guy comes in at $550 US plus taxes and shipping for the wheelbase on its own. And then if you were to pair the R12 with an RS or KS wheel, you're looking at around $820 US, again, plus taxes and shipping. And again, we do have a discount code available for Moza as well if you want to save a little bit there. So I'm going to keep going here and just run you through all the various different comparisons that I think you guys should be making and watching reviews of before you decide on this wheel. We then have the ASETEK La Prima wheel and base bundle, which comes in at $964.99 US. Again, we do have a 5% discount code available there. Pretty awesome experience with the La Prima bundle, but significantly more expensive than almost double the price. So yeah, not really a comparison. You then have the Logitech G Pro, which comes in at just a touch under $1,000 US. Again, we do have a 5% discount code available for that too. And that guy comes in at around 11 Newton meters. So very similar in terms of the strength. He does come with true force, which adds a little bit of extra fidelity into the force feedback on top of what you get with something like this. But again, you can check out the full review for all the details on that. A shame that they haven't expanded on their ecosystem, because they do have a quick release for the wheel. At the moment, that's pretty useless because they don't sell any other wheels. They also don't sell a shifter or handbrake that falls within their Pro line either. So definitely a consideration there. Again, check out the full review for all the details on that. And then we also have the new Turtle Beach Velocity 1 steering wheel, and that just launched in the last couple of days. We haven't had our hands on one yet, but we do have one on the way. So definitely subscribe so you don't miss out on that review. I'm very excited to check that one out because it looks quite different from anything that we've checked out before. And obviously Turtle Beach is a pretty well-known brand within the gaming space that should have quite a bit of R&D behind them. So very keen to check that out. $649.99 for that particular bundle, and that comes in at 7.2 Newton meters. But again, subscribe so you don't miss out on all the details of that. So at the end of all that, where we land with this guy here, the C12, is around 30 to 50% cheaper than any of those other alternatives that fall in at around the same kind of Newton meter strength at least. But as you guys know, at least I hope you know by now, Newton meter strength isn't the only thing that is important when it comes to the experience of using a direct drive wheel. So what exactly do you get with the C12? Let's unpack that now. So as I mentioned earlier, this is a fully integrated system. So you have an outrunner style motor, which sits at the back here. You can see these two T-clamps, as they call them, which do come included in the box. Those do have a standard FANATEC style mounting pattern here, but the clearance to the base itself is quite shallow, which means you're not going to be able to bolt this on to a lot of rigs that do have a standard FANATEC hole pattern, which is the reason why I would strongly suggest you also buy the table clamp. Now this does actually work really well. This also has a standard FANATEC hole pattern in the bottom here, so you can bolt it directly to your rig. And I was actually really impressed with the rigidity overall. The rigidity of the table clamp is actually really good as well, but when you start to push beyond about 5 to 8 Newton meters of peak strength, regardless of how strong the clamp itself is, you're going to find that it's going to start to send vibrations through your table or your desk, and that's going to start to make your monitor bounce, your keyboard bounce, your mouse bounce, and it's just not a good experience overall, in my opinion. So again, it will depend on the desk that you're running, but I would definitely recommend, if you're looking to run more than about 8 Newton meters of strength, probably are going to start to want to look at some sort of a wheel stand or some sort of a sim rig to attach this to. And of course, we do have a bunch of reviews right here on the channel for all kinds of products like that may or may not suit you. So check them all out so you get a good idea. But yeah, the table clamp actually works really well. You can see there is some angle adjustment here as well. So it allows us to adjust the angle of the wheel up and down a little bit too. Now you may also notice the little blower fan here too. Now the fan itself actually comes with the steering wheel, but it doesn't come with any way of mounting the fan, which is really strange. So the fan is just kind of loose inside the box. It plugs into the little fan header on the back here, which unfortunately isn't a standard PC fan socket. So you can't just plug in any fan that you want there. You could make an adapter, I suppose. But yeah, you plug in the little blower fan, but it doesn't have anything that you can attach it to there unless you have the table clamp, which it then integrates into. So another reason, again, why I think it's worthwhile to buy that table clamp, just to make everything a little bit cleaner. Now, there is some pretty beefy thermal management built into this. If you have a look in the software, you can actually see the current running temperature, and you can set a threshold for where you want it to go into a low power state. I think the default from memory was about 80 degrees Celsius. In reality, with the fan running, I never saw it go over about 45, even running at peak strength for an extended period of time. But if you do try to run fanless, inevitably at some point you will run into some thermal management going on, which will reduce the strength of the force feedback output. So be aware of that. As I said, outrunner style motor. So what that means is that everything is actually integrated into the base itself. The thing weighs in at about 4.8 kilograms by my measurement. And you can see the wheel itself actually rotates as an entire assembly around the outside of the core of the motor. So an outrunner style motor does have a few interesting characteristics, which we'll get into when we talk about the driving experience a little bit later on. But let's flip this guy back around to the front and talk a little bit more about what you get in terms of inputs, outputs, build quality, and whatnot. So 300 millimeter diameter round wheel. Really happy to see that. If you remember back to my review of the C5, which is a 5 Newton meter version of a similar kind of concept from Cammus, one of the big complaints that I had was that it was a D-shaped wheel, which does make it quite awkward for drifting and rally style driving. Now, not a problem for a lot of people, but given that you couldn't change the wheel easily on that particular setup, you know, it just made a lot more sense to me, at least, to have a completely round wheel because it gives you maximum versatility. So 300 millimeter and completely round is my ideal wheel in terms of overall versatility. A good diameter to allow you to drive pretty much everything from F1 style cars all the way through to your GT3, GT4 street cars, drifting, rally, you name it, you can do it absolutely fine with this kind of a design wheel. You can slip it through your hands very easily for drifting as well. And drifting was actually one thing that worked really, really well with this particular wheel. We'll get into that in the driving experience later on, but definitely one to check out if you're into your drifting. There's no ergonomic contours on the wheel at all. It is just a completely round wheel. That may bother some people, but for me, it was absolutely fine. In their literature, they do call it leather. I'm pretty sure it's not genuine leather. It definitely has a suspiciously plasticky kind of smell to it. But either way, it's a relatively good feeling material in the hands. A little bit of squish in the material there as well. It's definitely nothing that I would say screams low quality. And just overall, the build quality and the construction, the materials that we have here are all of a very high standard for the price point that we're looking at. So as you can see on the front here, we've got a standard 70 millimeter bolt pattern, which does mean that you can remove the rim itself and replace it with other rims. Now, unfortunately, there is a little catch to that, and this is the first pretty major design oversight, I would say, with this. So when you remove this cap, you can see here in this footage, there is a little stud with a nut on it, which pokes out from the back of this button plate. And what that means is if you're trying to mount a wheel that doesn't have a cutout for a horn, the wheel's not going to be able to sit flush. Now, you do have the option, of course, of adding a 5 millimeter spacer between the wheel and the button plate, and that will get you around that problem. But to me, at least, it just seems like a bit of a strange design choice because you have an abundance of various different wheels, particularly FANATEC have a really large selection of a lot of high quality rims that are relatively well priced. And you can't mount any of them without a spacer unless you drill a hole in the middle of the wheel to clear that little piece. So bit of an oversight there. But look, in terms of the design of the button plate itself, while ergonomically it's not fantastic, I think that they've hit a good balance here between versatility and ergonomics. So what I mean by that is that the clearances here to the areas of the clusters of buttons is quite good, which means that you can mount pretty much any rim. We tested probably 20, 30 different styles of rims on this. And other than that issue with the thing in the middle, all of them were able to clear the buttons absolutely fine, unless you started to get into some of those smaller formula style rims like 270, 280 millimeters. So you will obviously just need to be a little bit careful there, but they've done a good job here of designing the contours and clearances so that you can mount pretty much any rim here. Obviously, if you start to add a little bit of dish, that it's going to make things like the shifters and the buttons a little bit more difficult to reach, but you can use your own common sense there as to what's going to mount on the wheel nicely. And you can see the display for your telemetry as well as the RPM strip and flag LEDs on the sides are nice and high away from the rim too. So you shouldn't run into any issues with fouling or anything being blocked from your view, regardless of pretty much any rim that you chuck on here. So very, very happy to see interchangeable rims on this. Obviously, Obviously, it's not a quick release system that allows you to just pop one wheel off and pop another one on, but you're saving yourself quite a bit of money here. There's plenty of rim options available on eBay that will get you going here, and most of them do have a cutout for the horn as well, so you shouldn't run into too many issues with that little post that we talked about earlier. Now, in terms of buttons and inputs, it's a bit of an interesting mix here. There's a few things that I'm not 100% certain why they did the way they did. Now, the inputs themselves actually feel pretty good, but there's a few issues when it comes to consistency, which is a little bit strange. So the buttons themselves all have a good feeling. They are RGB backlit, and you can make adjustments to that in the software to make these pretty much any color that you want. They don't respond to things like telemetry out of the game like some other wheels do, but again, at this price point, I don't really see that as a complaint, just something to be aware of. One thing I did notice with the buttons is that the alignment is a little bit out on some, particularly that R4 button down the bottom there you can see is a little bit offset. So that's one small little quality control issue that I did run into. It's a little bit strange that we have silver hats on our funky switch and our analog hat switch, but everything else is black. But I was more interested to see that the rotary encoders at the top here are plastic hats, whereas down the bottom here, completely different style with anodized aluminium hats. Now, even more interestingly, these ones aren't push buttons, but these ones are. So yeah, a little bit of a strange design choice there. I would have much preferred to have exactly the same style as this up the top as well. These have come straight across from the Cammus C5, and I think if it had these buttons on it, it would give it a much more classy look and feel overall. But the buttons themselves have a relatively good feeling to them. They're certainly not the best buttons I've ever felt, but they do have a decent amount of squish to them, a good solid tactile click to let you know you've activated, and they're absolutely fine whether you're driving with or without gloves. As I mentioned before, you've got a little analog hat switch here, which can be used as a mouse as well if you select it inside the software, so you can use that to navigate around, although you don't have a right and left click mappable, so you're probably gonna end up having to use a mouse anyway, but good for navigating through menus or looking left and right inside the sim. You've got a 7-way funky switch on the right-hand side here as well, so you've got up, down, left, right, rotary encoder and push button functionality, pretty standard across most wheels. Personally, I prefer to have 2 of those rather than the analog hat switch, but that's a subjective personal preference thing. As I mentioned before, you've got 4 rotary encoders on the face of the wheel, 2 with push button functionality. You also have 2 thumb encoders on the top of the wheel here too. Now these do have push button functionality, but they're a little bit awkward to reach, as you'll see when we get into the driving experience a little bit later on. But overall, a good array of inputs on the front of the wheel, 22 inputs in total, including the shifters that we'll look at in just a moment. You then also have the telemetry display on the front, which can display your speed in kilometers or miles per hour or your current gear, and that's selectable within the software. You also have an RPM strip along the top here, which can be configured so it matches whatever car you're driving. And then 2 flag LEDs on either side. Now, we weren't able to actually get those functioning. I noticed that they were just kind of illuminated blue the whole time. Not 100% certain on the reason for that, but if I do get any updates, I'll let you know in a pinned comment down below. But the fact that they're there should hopefully mean that we see a little bit more functionality with those into the future. Build quality wise, very, very, very good for the price that you're paying. You can see the machined anodized aluminium enclosure that we have for the button plate itself. So this is a CNC machined piece of aluminium, which they then anodize, and then they run it through a second CNC machining process to give you that shiny edge there. So certainly not cheap to manufacture, and that's, I think, probably what surprises me most about this wheel for the price point. The quality and the finish. It's genuine carbon fiber on the faceplate here as well, and yeah, other than these plasticky rotary encoders here, which do give it a bit of a cheap feel overall, if you told me that this thing cost twice as much as it actually does, just based on the quality of the inputs and the feeling of it in the hands, I would probably believe you. And I think that that says quite a lot. One thing that I did notice when I was driving is that the stitching around these thumb areas is quite rough. Obviously not going to be an issue if you're driving with gloves, but I did find that my thumbs just on the inside here got a little bit sore. I don't get outdoors too much. I'm sure if you've got decent calluses on your thumbs, you're probably not going to have an issue with it, to be honest. I'm just whinging. But let's flip the wheel around now and have a look at what we have on the back here in terms of inputs. As I mentioned before, you do have these thumb encoders, which I actually find it's easier to press from the back of the wheel than trying to push with my thumbs on the inside, but again, we'll talk about that more when we get up and driving a little bit later. You've then got your 2 magnetic shifter paddles on the back here. They are quite loud. Metal to metal contact, so there's no little rubber stoppers or anything like that. You could easily add those if you wanted to, but overall, they've got a relatively good feeling to them. Again, for the price point, absolutely nothing to complain about. I do believe that they are micro switches internally, but no reason to believe that they should be unreliable. There's no adjustment available here, so you can't move the pedals in or out or adjust the angle or anything like that. But nice 3mm thick carbon fiber for the paddles themselves. Again, not something that I expected to see for this kind of price point. And as you can see, pulling on the top or pulling in the middle, nice and sturdy, no issues to complain about there with flex whatsoever. One complaint that I do have ergonomically is that I did find when I was driving, quite often I would pull the shifter with my finger like this, kind of in the knuckle area, and then I found that when I released it again, my skin on my finger was actually getting pinched between the two sides of this, and a couple of times it actually really hurt me. It didn't draw blood or anything like that. There's no blood blisters or even bruises on the pad of my finger, but I did find that it took me by surprise a couple of times. So maybe increasing the gap there very slightly might make a difference. But again, with gloves on, I don't think that it's going to be an issue. The only thing that I would say is that there were a couple of times when I was driving with gloves where the material did get jammed in between, and it never actually missed a shift, but it did make the shifting feel a little bit awkward from time to time because it didn't quite bounce back to its completely neutral position. But yeah, look, I mean, again, for the price point, there really isn't anything to complain about here. As you can see, the anodized aluminium enclosure all around, as I mentioned before, 4.8 kilos for the entire assembly. And that is pretty much all there is to cover in terms of the build quality materials themselves. We'll open it up and have a quick look inside in just a moment too. But on the back here, you can see the inputs and outputs. So you've got a little reset switch here. You've got your power switch, which you hold down according to the manual for 3 to 5 minutes to switch on and off the unit, which I thought was a little odd, but it does work in 3 to 5 seconds. So I'm sure that's just a little mistake, but very simple to use. You've got your little fan header, as we mentioned before, for connecting your cooling fan, which is included with the wheel, not with the table mount. You've got a standard USB-B printer style USB cable, which they do include inside the box. And it is actually quite a nice cable too, with anodized aluminium ends on either side. There's no ferrite choke on it, but we didn't have any problems with EMI, and it is nice and long as well. You've then got your DC input jack. Now, I remember you guys got up me about this in my C5 review because I didn't recognize the connector. I've since got a little bit into RC cars, and I can tell you that this is an XT60 connector. I really hope I've got that right because I'm gonna get crucified in the comments if I'm wrong. But a nice solid connection there with, I believe, gold-plated terminals. But yeah, absolutely no issues. It goes in nice and stiff. It doesn't have any sort of retention. So if I just quickly grab the power supply cable over here, my concern with the C5 when we reviewed it, which has the same connector, is that there isn't any sort of a clip or anything that you press that actually locks that into position. And I was a little bit worried that it might work its way loose when driving. But look, honestly, it's a nice solid connection. We haven't had any issues with it whatsoever. And look, to be honest, what that means is that if you do step on the cable for some reason, or it gets yanked for some reason, it should just come out without damaging anything. And given that it slots in there solid enough that it doesn't come out due to vibrations or anything like that, I think it's probably a pretty good choice. So I'm happy to go back on my word and stand corrected from what I said in my C5 review, and I'm sure a few people in the comments will be happy about that. Down below, we have 2 USB-C style ports. Now, we did run some LC100 load cell pedals connected to these ports. They don't operate as just a standard USB-C connection for connecting any other type of peripheral. So if you're wanting to connect a keyboard or a mouse or a webcam or something through these connections, unfortunately, you are out of luck. But if you've got pedals or a handbrake or a shifter from Cammus, you can connect them directly to the wheelbase. So just quickly before we move on to taking a quick look inside the unit, just want to quickly show you the power supply as well. We already talked about the connector on the end of it. So you can see it's a nice big unit here. It's actually exactly the same size power brick, and I believe from the same manufacturer as what you get with the CSDD and DD Plus from FANATEC, as well as the older DD1 and DD2. So this is rated for 24 volts DC at 14.59 amps, or just a touch over 350 watts for those who are interested. And it does have a little cooling fan inside the power supply, just like what we see with those other models that I mentioned earlier. I have seen a couple of failures with those cooling fans in DD1s and DD2s over the years. Hasn't happened to me personally, but I've seen a few people complain of their power supplies stopping powering up and those fans failing. So I don't know whether they're overheating or something like that. You know, active cooling is always a potential point of failure versus passive cooling. But I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of these these things out in the wild on DD1s and DD2s. And look, I've not seen a significant amount of failures, so I don't think that that's going to be a major issue for anyone. But of course, if you do buy one and you have problems, let us know down in the comments. So let's actually take the cover off this now and take a little bit of a look inside. We'll pop the wheel off, pop the front cover off, just have a look at the circuitry internally. I did attempt to pull apart the C5 previously and found that I actually had to break it apart to open it up, which I wasn't willing to do. So I just didn't think that it was going to really be beneficial to you guys, because what we were interested in with that particular one was to see whether it was possible to change the wheel, and it became apparent very quickly that it wasn't going to be a possible thing to do without major surgery. Thankfully, that's not the case with the C12, but let's pop the cover off now and take a bit of a look inside. Okay, now the part of the job that I enjoy the most, pulling stuff apart and seeing how it works. So, unlike with the C5, we were able to get this completely exposed pretty much for you guys. Hopefully it'll go back together and still work, but we did a lot of driving testing before we filmed this, just in case anything that we did here had any influence on how things felt afterwards. So yeah, we didn't pull it apart before we did any of our driving testing. So let's run through exactly what we have here. The first thing that I really like is the fact that it is such a modular system. We already talked obviously about the fact that you can remove the rims and replace them with other rims. We talked about that little piece at the front that's potentially got in the way of that too. You can see that there in more detail now. We'll look at that in just a minute. I also like the fact that the shifters are a module too. So that definitely opens the door for all sorts of aftermarket, modified and creative ideas when it comes to shifters. Not that there was anything wrong with these shifters out of the box, but yeah, definitely the opportunity there for some people to do some mods. We've then got the aluminium back shell of the button box itself, which we've separated from the motor. We'll move across to that in just a minute. Now, it does look to me like this is painted and then machined rather than anodized, as I said earlier. Not that it really makes a significant difference. These guys look like they may be anodized, but I'm pretty confident this is painted. But either way, nice and rigid here. You can see the nice big thick aluminium spacers providing the rigidity between the rim itself and where it mounts onto the motor housing. So this whole outer ring of the motor spins around the core. The button plate then bolts to this via these 4 bolts, 1, 2, 3, 4 here. So that provides a nice rigid mounting surface with no flex at all. And then the button plate bolts into that. So let's have a look at this motor here. This is quite interesting. So you can see the coils here, again, this is an outrunner style motor. So you can see the ring of magnets around the outside here. Those rotate around these coils, and that is how the motor works. Now, there's a good number of magnets here with relatively small gaps in between them. I'm by no means an electric motor expert, but what I can tell you is that there's not a large sensation of torque ripple or cogging or anything like that as we rotate the motor. There is an underlying grainy feeling to the force feedback in general. Now, it's interesting that that actually feels completely smooth. Now, again, the motor isn't energized right now, but if we look at the faceplate here, we've got this little piece here, which is a slip ring. And what this allows us to do is pass the power from the motor housing through to the button plate itself. So all the power for the entire button plate is all passed through these tiny little cables here. I'm assuming they must be rated for the amount of power that they're carrying. I mean, it's all LED, so it wouldn't be carrying a lot of power, but I thought that was quite interesting. So that slip ring allows this to spin. I probably shouldn't be holding it like this, but whatever. Allows it to spin around and still transmit power through to the wheel. And that does have a little bit of a grindy, rough feeling to it. So I don't know whether maybe that's where some of that texture in the force feedback feeling comes from, but either way, we'll unpack that more when we get into the driving experience and talk about the impact that that has on driving. But an interesting little observation there. Now, the other thing you'll notice here as well is there's a little magnet on the back of this post. And this is the post I was talking about before that blocks you from mounting a wheel with a flat surface without the cutout for a horn on the faceplate. So that magnet sits above that little IC that you see just down there. That is an encoder IC, which is what's responsible for actually measuring the rotation of the wheel. So you can imagine this whole part rotates with the outer ring independently of the core of the motor. And what happens is the magnetic field alters as that rotates, and that is what's interpreted by the position sensor as the rotation of the wheel inside the game. So quite a clever design there, similar to what we see in FANATEC's more modern products. So the power comes in to the slip ring, and then you can see the power comes out of the slip ring and into the wheel through this connector here. Now, you'll notice that all the connectors have this kind of glue attached to them to stop things from coming out. Unfortunately, I've had to compromise that glue when I've unplugged things. So I might end up replacing that just to make sure that nothing ever works its way loose. But look, in terms of the quality of the build, I don't really see any alarm bells at all. I mean, it's all high quality stuff. The quality of the soldering and everything looks to be absolutely fine. The PCB inside the motor housing is all wave soldered, and all the surface mount components, as you would expect here, are all wave soldered too. You can see the pass-through components on the PCB have been hand soldered by the looks of things, but they all look to be relatively clean solder joints. There's no dry joints anywhere that I can see. Some of these, that one's a little bit dry there. Not the best solder job I've ever seen, but I think it'll be okay. But yeah, there's no cables running through to each of the individual switches, so I don't see really any concerns there. One thing I do notice is the little retainer nuts on the back of these switches. Given how much glue they've used elsewhere, they haven't put any glue on these little nuts to hold them in place, so we may see some switches start rattling over time, but I mean, that's pretty common. It's pretty common. You see that on most wheels. And yeah, I don't see anything there that is cause for concern whatsoever, particularly for the price point. I think they've done a really good job. And again, just to reiterate, I really love the idea of having such a modular design here that allows you to remove shifters and whatnot. And yeah, so let me know down in the comments below if you've got any other questions relating to any of the stuff in here. But I think at a top level, that covers everything that we're interested in for now. So let's put it back together now and move on into talking about the software and driving experience. So let's take a look at the Cammus Racing software package now. So this is a little bit more limited than what you're used to seeing on a lot of the other competitor brands that we've looked at in the past. Again, what I would recommend you do is go have a look at those review videos so you can see for yourself exactly what each of them bring to the table in terms of functionality. And then you'll be better informed to make a decision as to what you think is going to suit you best. But look, this is relatively approachable. You'll see as we get on through here. The other thing I want to mention as well, there is a smartphone app that allows you to connect to the base via Bluetooth and make the same adjustments on the phone as you can make here. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get that working. It said to push the two top buttons in for 3 to 5 seconds to enable pairing mode, but it never actually ended up doing that. So yeah, we were able to get it working on the C5, but we weren't able to get it working on the C12. So just be aware of that. So in the software package, it shows all the connected Cammus devices, just like what you see with most other competitor brands these days. So you can see the base and the wheel showing up here. As with the C5, it did kind of lead me to think that maybe they might release different wheels in the future that you could interchange. Not talking about the rim here, I'm talking about the actual physical button plate and wheel. They've told me that that's not the case, but if you connect their pedals, they'll show up in here as well, and you can make configuration adjustments to those too. But let's click down on the parameter tab for now. This is where we can make adjustments to all of our force feedback effects. So we've got our steering range here. That can vary between 0 degrees, obviously, not that you'd ever go that low, all the way up to 2,520 degrees. So really good for truck sims and whatnot. For most sim racing type stuff, you're gonna be probably operating somewhere between 360 and 900 degrees, but you can arbitrarily select the degrees of rotation that you want within the adjustable range there. You then got your adjustment for the output power of the base or the dynamic range. So we've got that set to 100% at the moment. What I like to do is adjust the output of the game down slightly so we're not clipping inside the game, and then adjust the power level here to suit me and what I want to feel as my maximum amount of strength ever coming out of the wheelbase. So there's quite a lot of debate around what's the best way to adjust things here. My thinking is that you set the base to the maximum amount of power that you ever want to feel in a crash scenario. That will then cap your dynamic range. A lot of other brands these days allow you to actually cap the maximum output separately from what the standard torque level adjustment is. In this case, it is just a single adjustment here, so you will be limited the dynamic range if you reduce this, although you can, if you go into game effects, lower the or scale the output of the game if you wish to do it that way. So there's a few things that you can tweak and adjust here. Look, to be honest with you, I didn't feel a massive difference tweaking any of these settings, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here. If you guys are interested, let me know. We might do a separate settings guide or something like that. We'll also see what they release in terms of recommended settings as well, because you can see on the right hand side here, there is the ability to import and export profiles. So maybe they'll release some suggested profiles of their own. So we click back on base settings now. We then have adjustments for our natural damping, which these all do have tooltips, although they are written in a little bit of broken English. But the natural damping, basically what that does is it allows you to add a little bit of damping to the overall signal to reduce things like robotic feeling or oscillation. Didn't find that I needed to run this particularly high on this particular wheelbase. It is a very subjective thing, but somewhere under about 20% felt pretty good to me depending on the sim. One thing I do want to mention here is that consistency in feeling between sim racing titles was very good, just like we found with the C5. It has generally gotten a lot better across all brands these days. It used to be that FANATEC really had an edge when it came to consistency across sim racing titles. And what I mean by that is if you jump in, say, a Ferrari 488 GT3 Evo car in iRacing, and then you jump in the same car in ACC, it should feel fundamentally similar to drive in terms of what you feel through the wheel. Obviously, there are nuances between the different sim racing titles, but it shouldn't feel completely different. And that's where I always used to feel like FANATEC had a bit of an edge, but everybody else has kind of caught up these days. So that's our natural damping adjustment. We then have a natural friction adjustment. This just increases the amount of friction that you feel, or the sensation of weight in the steering wheel as you turn it. Now, what I did find, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we get into the driving experience, but adding a lot of friction here did add quite a grainy feel to the force feedback overall, which is why I preferred to keep it down lower. Most games these days have a natural kind of friction inherently built into the driveline of the car that you're driving anyway. So they kind of output that friction as part of the game signal. So you don't generally need to run a lot of friction at a driver level. That's the reason why I generally like to keep this pretty low. Natural inertia, similar to friction, what this does is it adds a sensation of weight behind the components of the steering rack. So you can imagine if you're yanking the steering wheel, you've got the weight of the wheels, the tires, the steering rack, everything kind of creating its own inertia as it rotates. So what that means is that when you stop rotating the steering wheel, you're still going to feel it sort of trying to continue to move in the same direction. So you feel that inertia through the steering wheel. Now, I didn't find that this adjustment made a significant amount of difference in the wheel. All these other adjustments, you can actually feel the immediate impact of the adjustment in the wheel just when you're sitting in the pits. But that natural inertia setting didn't seem to have a very large effect compared with other competitor products. And then we have the idle spring, which is purely just for games that don't have their own return to center signal coming out of the game. And again, if we go across to game effects, you can see there is an adjustment for game spring. That is a modifier for the signal coming out of the game, whereas what we have over on base settings is a driver level adjustment for a similar thing. So if the game doesn't have a return to center, what you'll find is that with that on 0, wherever you stop rotating the wheel, it will just stop. If you crank that up, then the wheel will try to rotate back to the middle. And the percentage adjustment there will stipulate how aggressively it does that. So I just leave that on 0 because most modern sim racing titles these days, outside of the sort of Simcade side of things, have the return to center built into them anyway. So that is everything you need to know in terms of settings. As I said, pretty limited here, but having said that, it is pretty approachable. One thing I would like to see is the tooltips being improved a little bit so that they make a little bit more sense in English. I just find that those confuse me more than they help me. But if you're somebody that doesn't know anything about any of these settings, you may find those tooltips useful. We then have a tab here for assistance as well. That just allows us to do things like invert the force feedback, enable hands-off protection, or end stop strength as well. So being a direct drive wheelbase, it can rotate infinitely in terms of the mechanical design. So when you reach that limit that you set in terms of rotation, it'll stipulate how solid or how soft that bump stop feels in your hands. High speed stability assist. This is just to counteract the effects of oscillation inside the game. I didn't run into any issues at all with oscillation during my testing, so I didn't really see that to be an issue. And then we have our overheat protection, as we were mentioning earlier on. So with the fan running, I don't have the fan connected to this now, but with the fan running, I never actually saw this go over about 45 degrees. We're in an ambient condition here of about 21 degrees with the air conditioner running. If you're in a hot environment, you may run into issues there, but you can see this does allow us to actually adjust the threshold between 75 and 85 degrees for where it cuts into thermal overload and reduces the power output. So nice that they give you that adjustment there. Obviously, they're not going to allow you to adjust it high enough that it's actually going to cause physical damage to the device. So I don't really see why you would ever want to run it lower than 85 degrees. I would probably just leave that maxed out. And there's some error codes here as well that allow you to see, if you get an error code on the screen, what exactly that means. Then we go down to device and we can make a couple of adjustments here too. So we can see a visual representation of all of the inputs on the wheel. We can also click on that simulate mouse function that I talked about earlier, or simulate keyboard arrow for the hat switch. If you want to do that, you can also set your wheel center from here too, as well as adjust the steering angle, just like what we could do in the parameter setting earlier on. We then click across on the dashboard, and this is where we can make adjustments to the outputs on the front of the wheel. So we can adjust our screen brightness from pretty dim to pretty darn bright. I've got it set at the minimum and it was bright enough for me, to be honest. We can adjust the telemetry modes of the 3x7 segment display on the front of the wheel as well. So we can choose between kilometers per hour, miles per hour, or displaying the gear that we're in. So it's simply just a checkbox for each of those. We can adjust the color of each individual segment of the RPM gauge from 1 through to 15. So to do that, all you do is just click on the LED and choose the color that you want. You can create custom colors or set a custom value here with a HTML value if you wish to do so. So pretty standard stuff here. Most brands have a similar kind of thing now. We also have some color presets here as well. So from what I can tell, no ability to adjust the scaling of the RPM gauge to match the different types of cars that you're driving. I didn't notice when I was driving, and I did drive a variety of different cars, didn't notice that it was ever significantly out, but yeah, I'm sure there'll be some scenarios where it doesn't match the car that you're driving, and that's just one thing to be aware of. You don't seem to be able to adjust that from what I can tell. We can also adjust the backlight color of our buttons here as well. Unlike competitor brands, we don't have the ability to have those actually react to telemetry data, but again, for the price point, I don't really see that as being a point of complaint, but we can click on each one and then set a color for each one just like so. So say, for example, if I want red for one of the buttons, I can do that. Click OK, and now my L1 button up here should be red. So a little bit hard to see on camera there. One thing I did notice is that when you're adjusting that brightness, it does appear to only adjust the brightness of the telemetry screen itself and not the other buttons and LEDs. So just one thing to be aware of there. Let me just quickly go in and copy that HTML code for that button again and paste it back on my L1 button so everything is exactly the same. Nice that you have the ability to do that because it means that you can be consistent with all your colors. Then again, we have presets here as well. So if you want to change colors like so between their different presets, you can do so. I'm just going to go back to preset 1. And then down the bottom here, we have the ability to switch the modes for these two rotary encoders to multi-position switch mode. So it doesn't work for the thumb encoders or these bottom ones down here, just the two top ones, which is a little bit interesting. So we can switch between a rotary encoder mode, which sends a pulse in either direction when we turn the knob, or we can change it to a multi-position switch mode, which allows you to correlate a value to the value inside the game. So say, for example, you're inside the sim, you are starting in engine map 1, you go 3 clicks to the right, it'll correlate to engine map 3. That way in multi-position switch mode, it would always correlate to position 3. Whereas if you exit out of the sim and then go back in again in rotary encoder mode, what you'd find is that it would default back to the 0 position. So map 3 would then become position 6 and so forth. It just gets out of whack. So nice that you can choose between the two modes for sims that don't necessarily support that. But what you can see here, if we go back to the steering wheel, if I rotate the one on the left, you can see the number goes up by 1 click every time, back down between 45 and 56, whereas the one on the right is just pulsing up and down unless I switch that mode. And then if I switch the mode to gear, we should see it will now, yep, there we go. So that gives you a good idea of exactly what that's doing. Now, I haven't run into any reliability issues with the software itself, haven't had any issues with crashing or anything like that. I have heard a few reports of other people with the C5 having some issues. The only issue I had was just that I couldn't get it to connect to my phone, as I mentioned earlier. We then also have an update tab here as well that allows you to update your firmware. And it's actually exactly the same firmware update process as you have on FANATEC bases. It even looks the same when the little console comes up. So no issues there. Didn't come across any dramas whatsoever. It was just as simple as clicking the flash button and then rebooting the wheel once it's said to do so. And everything was fine. So yeah, look, I mean, it is limited in what it can do, this software, compared to some other competitors, but all the basics are there. And look, again, for the price, I really don't see any reason to complain. So let's move on now and talk about the driving experience. So what is the Cammus C12 like to drive with? Now, look, honestly, this is a little bit of a mixed bag. I think primarily the main thing that stands out in the positive side with this wheel is just the sheer strength that you get at the price point. There really isn't anything else that even comes close in terms of a comparison if you're just after something that's going to give you the immersion of wrestling against a car with really strong force feedback. So in that regard, I think if that's the most important thing to you, you really want to be pulled into the immersion of wrestling against a car, then this is a very, very strong offering for the price point. But having said that, there are quite a few sacrifices here as well. So to unpack the experience of actually driving this a little bit more, there are definitely some shortcomings here with regards to the quality of the force feedback. And that was one thing that disappointed me. You'll remember if you saw my C5 review about 7 or 8 months ago now, one of the things that we mentioned is that there was a slight underlying graininess to the force feedback. Now, I said in that review that it wasn't overly noticeable when you're driving. Unfortunately, with the C12, it kind of feels like all the characteristics of the C5 have been amplified, and that of course also amplifies the shortcomings as well. So there is a underlying sense of graininess in the force feedback, both in terms of the detail and just in the smoothness rotating the wheel. Now, you do feel that graininess with the wheel energized, even just turning the wheel without even being in a sim. But when you're driving around, when you've got all the force feedback effects happening, there is a lot of detail, there is a lot of fidelity in the force feedback, but there is that underlying kind of robotic graininess to the force feedback, which you just don't get with other direct drive products at this kind of strength level. Now, again, all those other products that we can compare to in terms of strength, as we looked at earlier in the pricing section, are all significantly more expensive than this is. So again, it's kind of awkward comparing it to those because you have to factor in the fact that this is so much cheaper. Of course, there's going to be some sacrifices that come along with that. But look, the overall responsiveness of the wheel is very good, particularly with drifting, just like what I said with the C5. Very, very snappy and responsive, no lag, no real need to sort of feed the wheel through to catch up with what the car's doing. It does rotate fast enough that it's able to react to the slip angle of the car, and drifting felt very, very natural straight away with this wheel, exactly like what we had with the C5. So that was definitely a nice thing. But then look, there are a few awkward elements with regards to the ergonomics of the wheel as well. Now, of course, they do have to make some sacrifices here to allow you to be able to change the wheel. So we don't want to be too harsh on them in this regard. Obviously, we prefer this kind of design to having holes cut out in the wheel for buttons to poke through, which would mean that you couldn't put other rims on it at all without modifying those rims as well. But it is a little bit awkward to operate both the analog and the 7-way switch as well as these rotary encoders. They're just a little bit cramped in behind these buttons. Not so much of an issue on the top here because it is generally a more intentional move across with your hand to operate these guys. The thumb encoders as well are a little bit awkward to operate the push button functionality. You can't really get your thumb in there to push from the side. So you end up having to push them with your index finger like so, rather than kind of getting your thumb. You can do it, but it's just a little bit awkward. With a slightly larger diameter rim, that wouldn't be a problem. But look, overall, the 300mm diameter round wheel is a very, very versatile wheel. I think that it's a really intelligent choice here. It means that you can drive pretty much any style of car, as you can see in the driving footage here, and have a good experience. So I think they've absolutely nailed it with regards to that. That was one of the complaints I had with the C5 was, although it was very versatile, it had that D-shaped wheel, which made it quite awkward for rallying and drifting, where you want to be able to slip the wheel through your hands. So definitely a good design choice there. Maybe they were listening to our previous video and decided to take that on board. Now, being a PC compatible only product, you do have an abundance of choice when it comes to pedals, but I know that a lot of people like to buy everything from the one brand and kind of just have the one ecosystem to operate within. So another thing that I think is important to mention here is that we're actually testing out a set of new pedals from Cammus at the moment, and I do have quite a few issues with them in terms of the fundamental design. Now, they have only sent them to us as a test unit. They are asking for feedback at this point in time, so I'm hoping they'll be able to implement a lot of the suggestions that we have for them before that product releases. So look, at this point in time, there isn't really a high quality set of load cell pedals that I would recommend purchasing from Cammus. I would definitely recommend looking elsewhere. I'd say at this kind of price point, the best option that I could recommend would probably be the FANATEC CSL Elite V2 pedals. As you guys have seen me say many times now, those are absolutely exceptional value for money when it comes to a load cell set of pedals. Remembering again, of course, that you will have to factor in how you're actually planning to operate those. So again, if you're using it at a desk, then you will have to have some way with any load cell pedals to prevent them from sliding around on the floor. And that kind of brings us back to that point of, you know, when you're looking at this kind of class of product in terms of the overall strength that it offers, you're probably starting to get into the territory where you are going to be wanting to look at having some sort of way to have this fixed rather than just having it mounted to the table and having your pedals sitting on the floor. Now, of course, the form factor here does have the advantage of being able to get your monitor up nice and close as well. So that is one other big positive with this particular wheelbase over other competitor products. But look, I think overall, the best way I can summarize the experience with this is that it feels hardware-wise nice and rigid, nice and solid, high quality for the price, but the actual driving experience with it does feel a little bit unrefined. There is that graininess in the force feedback, which you just don't get with other competitor products, albeit at lower price points. But having said that, other products at lower price points that are more similar to this, although they are weaker in terms of the force feedback, the actual quality of the force feedback, the detail and the smoothness is better than what you get with the C12. So look, I think the best way I can summarize it is this: if you're looking for the maximum amount of force feedback strength that you can get at the price point, then this is definitely a good option. I do find that it immerses me in the gameplay a lot more than other wheels do at this particular price point, simply because you are really kind of wrestling against the car. Whether or not that makes you faster or slower is an area of debate as well. You never want to be in a situation where the car is driving you rather than you driving the car, and that point is going to obviously depend on your own upper body strength, how strong your arms are. For me, somewhere between that sort of 10 to 14 Newton meter for most cars ends up being where I am. So look, for me personally and subjectively, if this was my limit in terms of budget to purchase a wheel and a wheelbase, I would probably end up going with one of the FANATEC Ready to Race bundles, which includes pedals as well, particularly that 8 Newton meter bundle that comes with the P1 wheel and CSL pedals. Now look, they're not fantastic pedals. They're $80 pedals that are included there. You can upgrade them to a load cell if you want to, and there's plenty of mods that you can do as well, which there's plenty of info available online for you. But for $499, including pedals, I do think that that provides an overall more refined driving experience just across pretty much every single facet other than just the overall strength that you're getting there. And I do think that 8 Newton meters of strength is going to be enough to satisfy the majority of people looking for something at around this kind of price point. So that would be my personal choice there. But what I would recommend is, if you're in the market for something like this, if you have a friend that has a CSL DD with a boost kit, have a drive of it, see whether you feel like it's strong enough for you or not. And I think that's probably going to put you in a better place to make a decision, because overall I think that is a more complete package than what we have here. It does have more flex in the wheel. The quality of the wheel itself and the touch points isn't anywhere near as high as what we have here, but the actual driving experience I think is better. But what about if you've been looking at a more expensive setup at around that kind of 10 to 12 Newton meter mark? So say something like an ASETEK La Prima, an Alpha Mini, a CSDD, a Logitech G Pro. Is there a compelling reason to go with something like this instead and save yourself some money over a bundle like that? And look, I think when you put this product in that context, they have done a very, very good job with it. I don't know whether they're going to be able to refine that driving experience more over time. I feel like the graininess that we're describing probably is a characteristic of the motor itself rather than something that can be fixed with firmware. And the reason I say that is because we did feel those same kind of characteristics with the C5 earlier on. But, you know, maybe I'm completely wrong there. Maybe they will be able to refine it over time. I just don't know. But look, for me personally, I would say that graininess in the force feedback detail is something that I do notice all the time when I'm driving with this wheel. Now, of course, I have the benefit of having had exposure to a lot of much more expensive equipment, and therefore, you know, I know what I'm missing out on with this wheel. If this is the first wheel that you've bought, then you may be completely happy with it. But knowing what I'm missing out on with this compared to some of those other bundles, I personally could justify the costs to spend the extra and go with any one of those bundles. And look, all those options are really great. There really isn't a bad choice at the moment within that kind of sector of the market if you're looking at stepping up into a direct drive wheel. But look, I think for the price, they have done a good job here. Hopefully they can refine things a little bit more into the future. But look, I'm happy to see a product of this caliber with this amount of strength released at this kind of price point. I think that it does light a rocket under a lot of these other manufacturers to, you know, be more competitive with their pricing. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether people go for this, knowing the limitations that that it has, whether or not they think that it's worth the saving over some of those more expensive options. So time will tell, guys. But yeah, for the price, I think they've done a good job. I'm just disappointed that the quality of the force feedback, although the strength is there, isn't a little bit higher. And I think it's as simple as that, guys. So really hope that today's video has helped you out. If it has, please do leave a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future videos. We will be doing a review very soon of the new Turtle Beach Velocity 1 direct drive wheel as well, which I'm very excited to share with you guys. So definitely make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. We do have a lot of other videos as well. We've compared a lot of the other products that we've referenced in today's video too. So I would recommend spend the time, watch all of those videos. It'll give you a good picture of what's going to suit your particular needs and budget best, because everything does come with its strengths and weaknesses. You know, as I said, there isn't really a bad choice, but some brands are stronger in some areas than others are. And you know, you have an abundance of choice, so it's worthwhile spending the time to do the research and making sure you're making the best choice for your personal circumstances. But that is the Cammus C12. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.